All right, so it's free. Let's see if we can just drop it. So I'm going to get started here at the back of the truck and start removing the drive shaft. I'm sure you could do it in any particular order, but kind of have a game plan as to how I want to get everything pulled. So we'll start back here. We'll move on to the carrier bearing, which will then drop the intermediate drive shaft that goes to the transmission. Just make sure you have a pan, because that will probably make a little bit of a mess. So now moving on to the carrier bearing. Hopefully these will break loose. I have been soaking these in some penetrating fluid. And then of course, if you have an impact, that would be a lot easier. But this morning is quite cool for this time of year, but should make it nice with getting all this removed. So the carrier bearing is just floating. Everything with the drive shaft is ready for removal. Just need to push it forward. So that will remove the U-joint from the rear end. And I just have a jack here helping me sustain it, and we should be able to remove it. I do have a pan to catch any transmission fluid. So let me catch you guys up. It may seem like things have gotten slightly out of hand, but actually I plan to do it this way, and I'm really not too far ahead from where you guys last saw. So the reason the truck is on jack stands is to take the load off of the suspension. Just as a precaution, you do need to remove this middle brace here, this cross member that sits right underneath the transmission. There's two bolts that are very easy to get to, and there are two more very difficult ones that sit right here, and one is a little farther back. So you have to reach up in and under the C channel here and then loosen it from the top. So that took quite some time, but they are all out. So I just need to wedge this out. From there, I will remove the exhaust, and then the transmission cross member comes next, and we should be able to pull the transmission. So just a quick recap: you need to remove your drive shaft. Start here at the back, the carrier bearing. Once you do that, you can push the drive shaft forward and then pull it out of the transmission. That cross member needs to come out. The exhaust will be next, just so it's not in the way, and then this rear transmission cross member, support the transmission somehow, and then use a jack to pull it out once we loosen the torque converter and all the bolts that go to the engine. So next will be the exhaust. I left the back hanger just loosely in place so that it supported all of the weight, and it was easier to take off or remove the exhaust up at the headers there, the manifolds. But now that that's loose, you guys can see with no cross member in the way, it's easy just to pull back and drop the whole exhaust in one piece. So we'll get this out of the way, and now we just gotta drop the transmission.
All right guys, so now that the exhaust is out of the way, there are still a few more steps needed in order to be able to drop the transmission. In no particular order, one of those being to remove the transmission cooler lines. So I went ahead and did that already. You just have two connections on this right side of the transmission on the passenger side, and then those go up to the radiator. So those are out of the way. I still need to get to the speedometer cable here, and this is for the vacuum modulator. So I just need to cut this, and that line goes all the way up to the back of the intake manifold, so you do need to remove that as well. This cross member here that supports the back of the transmission is already loose. I removed the bolts that have that in place. Now we just need to break this free. So now that this is removed, that will allow us to jack up the transmission just enough to get this bushing to come free of the cross member, and then we are able to remove this. I did already remove the bolt. There is one bolt on each side, so this should come free. Of course, from there we will still support the transmission. We need to remove the bell housing bolts. There are still a few in there. I did remove, I believe 3 of them already, but I did keep 2 in just to make sure it's still secure to the engine. As far as the torque converter, we need to remove the inspection plate, which will allow you to gain access to the torque converter bolts. There are 4. You need to remove those, and the way you access those is actually one at a time. With the inspection cover off, you remove one, and then you just bump the engine over with the key. You want to make sure that you don't fully start the engine, but you just bump it over enough for it to spin and get you to the other one. So those are all removed as well. So honestly, the last thing to do is just to jack the transmission up, remove the last 2 bell housing bolts, and this should all come down. Ideally, you want to use a transmission jack. I've done this before with the regular standard jack, but you want to be very, very careful. So let's go ahead and remove this speedometer cable, and then we will get this free. So we're just going to set this aside and get it out of the way here. So the way that I'm going to support the transmission is right across the pan here, and I'm going to use a 2x6. So that this will span the width of the pan and take a majority of the weight on these 2 points. This is how I removed the transmission from the 70 F350. And hopefully this goes as planned. So now that the transmission crossmember is out of place, I'm going to drop the transmission down just a little bit. Make sure that is tight. Like I mentioned, I did already remove some of the bolts to the bell housing, so now I'm going to go ahead and remove the rest, and then we should be able to just pull this off slightly and drop it down. So this is what I found when I removed the flex plate. The back of the block has been painted, which leads me to believe that at some point this 390 was rebuilt, which is quite a nice surprise, but kind of makes sense. A while back I had removed the valve covers and the valve train was immaculate, super clean, but the rear main seal looks good. I don't see any oil really, so I don't believe it's leaking there. All the oil I do see looks like it's coming from the oil pan, so I might try to replace this gasket before we put the 4-speed back in the truck, but quite a nice surprise. Now let's move on to the interior. Alright guys, so as far as the interior goes, it really wasn't that difficult. There are quite a few steps to get everything out, but I'm going to go over those with you guys right now. For starters, remove this little cover. There are 2 small screws that go here and hold it to the dash assembly. Once you remove those little screws, that should pop right out. That'll give you access to 2 bolts from underneath that will hold the steering column in place. Break those loose and then move on to the engine bay, where you will remove the rag joint. There are a few brackets on the firewall and one on the interior down here that you need to break loose. Once you do that, fully remove the 2 bolts and the steering column should come right out. Now, as far as the pedal assembly, that was a little bit more difficult. You do have 6 bolts on the firewall. I would also recommend breaking loose your brake booster and kind of pulling forward the whole assembly with the master cylinder. You will probably bend your lines a little bit out of place, but moving that forward gives you easier access to the bolts on the firewall. So once you remove those on the firewall, you do have 2 in here behind the dash. So prior to getting to those, of course, you want to remove your gauge cluster, the bezel, to get good, easy access to all that. Once you remove those, you do also want to make sure that you break loose your rod that goes to the brake booster. That's the step I forgot to mention just a bit ago. But once you do all that, everything should come out. So now that we're all wrapped up there, everything is ready to go back in reverse order. I do have the clutch pedal assembly all powder coated and ready to go. The steering column that I rebuilt, all ready to go. So it should be a lot easier to get everything back in the truck.